365 days, but I treat every day like it's my last. I'm only concerned with building on the future, cause I can't change my past. Positive vibes for positive lives. She just giving you that truth and shifting your mind. It's more mental than you realize. It's up to you to take control, cause this world is cold and negativity gon' take its toll. Now we've been told any day could be your last. I'm embracing every moment and I cherish every laugh, every smile, every hug, every kiss, every touch, every person in my life that I care about and love. But wait, maybe I'm getting too emotional. That's exactly what they say you ain't supposed to do. Suppress your feelings, never talk about your pain. Can't appreciate the sun without acknowledging it rains, right? That's right. So this a moment of clarity. And make sure you always protect your energy. You stay focused and your life gon' be lit. And you are now rocking with Celeste, the therapist. Let's go.
Hey, hi. So, hi, beautiful people. If you are watching me on a replay, thank you for watching me. I appreciate you. My name is Celeste. I'm a therapist from Boston. I come on, I talk to people who are doing things to empower the lives of others by sharing their story. And the goal behind what I do is to just help people shift the way they think. I've come to realize that a lot of people have gotten really stuck. And the reason why we get stuck is because we feel alone. And the reason why we feel alone is because we're not, we don't know about all the different areas that can help us grow. It can help us heal. And I've met amazing people who are helping my audience do that. And it's been such an amazing journey. July is going to be 3 years of podcasting, which has been so amazing. So this is actually an audio podcast. In July of 2020, I decided to take it on video. And so now we have the video and the audio. And so I'm going to introduce my amazing guest to the screen and have her introduce herself to you all. Hi, amazing guest. How are you today?
Wonderful. How are you?
Good. Can you introduce yourself to my audience?
Yes, I am Barbara Ceptus Schreiber. I too grew up in Boston. So that's where I grew up. I now live outside of DC. And I am somebody who, like you, likes to work with people who are stuck to help people move and come into themselves. And I work primarily with Black, Indigenous women of color around healing trauma, specifically sexual trauma. So
and Barbara left out doctor. She is I don't know why you didn't say Dr. Barbara. Can we say it again with the doctor? Yes. You got a whole PhD behind your name. Come on now.
Thank you, Dr. Barbara Ceptus Schreiber. You know, it's been a struggle to own that.
I know.
We can talk about that, right?
That's like a whole podcast.
Yes, on its own. I've been a doctor for solid 10 years, and there are people in my life who are just finding out.
That's amazing, Dr. Barbara. I'm thankful for you being here. One of the things that you do a lot of self-awareness, consciousness, spiritual consciousness awareness. So I want to get into that. But before I talk about that, I really want my audience to know like who you are. So you did say you were raised in Boston.
Yes.
And you are of Haitian descent.
Yes, ma'am.
A lot of people think I'm Haitian because of my last name. And I was like, no, my husband's Haitian. I barely know how to pronounce my last name now. It used to be Jones. It was a lot easier. When I got my bachelor's degree, I was middle in line. When I got my master's, I had to wait to the end. Everybody was gone. So what was it like being raised in a Haitian household?
Oh, gosh, what was it like? Well, I have to say I was born in Haiti. I'm first generation Haitian immigrant. And I came to the United States when I was 6 and lived between Boston, Massachusetts, and Florida. So both of these like centers of Haitian community. What was it like? Some aspects were wonderful, right? So I was thinking about resilience recently. We were talking about, I was doing the ACE score. And ACE also has the resiliency measures that they do. And while my ACE, and for those who don't know, ACE measures adverse experiences in life. And that's supposed to determine kind of health outcomes later in life, right? Mm-hmm. But they also have this thing around resilience. And resilience is what allows you to, in my language, survive, right? Kind of thrive, even though you experience trauma. And growing up in Haiti, the resilience came from the fact that I grew up with these amazing women, right? I have this triad in my life who were the mamas. Like I have three mamas. They just raised me. I have my mom who birthed me. I have my mabu who raised me. I have my aunt, my aunt, who's also like, another mama. So I have these three incredible women who I knew as my mom, right? At any time. So I grew up with this sense of surrounded by feminine grace and beauty and strength, and it was just there, right? That was just what I knew as my everyday. That was Haiti. And then coming to the United States, I grew up in a Pentecostal community within Boston, right? And that had its plus and minuses in that I was constantly surrounded by people who reaffirmed my Haitianness, who had a sense of a visceral pride around being Haitian. And this is, in the 80s and the 90s. And for the children of the 80s and 90s, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of
It was a lot of it.
anti.
What was that about? What was the anti-Haiti about?
The AIDS crisis, right? The HIV crisis. Haiti got
Mhm.
named as one of the vectors of contagion for the HIV virus, and so there was a lot of violence, right? And if I can just link that to what's happening with Asian American communities now, this is something that's coming back around, right? Where like the supremacy cycles hate, it's coming back around. So if being raised Haitian in the 1980s in the U.S. was particularly hard, right? Because you were contagion, you were disease, you were unwanted, and Haiti had this terrible image around it, and so that was there. But the resilience that I got from being raised within this incredibly loving and prideful community stays with me till today, right? So these moments of like, as I'm talking about trauma and generational trauma in my own story, just kind of also prefacing it by thinking about the way that these communities that I grew up in also provided these incredible tools of resilience that I get to use and give to others in the work that I do now.
When you think about the women in your life and just women that you've known growing up in a Pentecostal environment,
Mhm.
did you see Black women take care of themselves as they're taking care of other people?
No, that one, no, right? And that was always, for me later on in life, became something that I was very clear I didn't want to repeat, right? Um, the primary goal of these mamas was to take care of everybody else. And that's what they did. And they did it beautifully to a fault, right? I tell this story about how I did the eulogy at my grandmother's funeral. And it wasn't until that eulogy and me sort of reaching out to the elders and, trying to put together her story that I realized that a lot of the children she raised weren't her birth children. She died at 98, right? And so her ability to kind of create community and birth family out of her sheer willingness to love and to nurture was that big, right? Was that big. And so that was the example I grew up with around what it meant to nurture, what it meant to be a mother, what it meant to take care. And the women around me, the women in the church, did not, right? They didn't prioritize their self-care. It was much more about being that that image of motherhood that you wanted others to see and appreciate, and that wasn't always a great example.
And I feel like, especially in like the Haitian culture, I think that being a woman is equated to cooking and cleaning and taking care of other people. Like
Mhm.
it's kind of like this is, it feels good. This is what I'm supposed to do, but never in the mix is part of it is when is my time. And when you said that, later on, I realized that's not where I wanted to be. That's not what I wanted to do. Do you remember that moment, or do you
Oh,
remember how it took place for you internally? Because
yeah.
that's big. A lot of people aren't able to make that distinction. I think our
Mhm.
environment ends up being the way that we kind of decide to go through life, not
Mhm.
realizing we're doing it based off of what we've
Right.
seen. You did
Yes.
the opposite. What was that like for you to do the
I
opposite?
didn't I didn't always do the opposite, right? Like that awareness wasn't always there. So when you ask a question about the moment when I realized that, I think that moment for me came kind of in the middle of doing just that, repeating just that cycle, right? And that for me, also link it back to trauma. But when I had my children, when I had my first, I was in the middle of a postdoc, and after I had her, it was incredibly important for me, and I want to be clear about this. Like, it was a clear-headed decision that I stopped what I was doing to stay home to take care of her, And then in the process had two more children, I have three total. In the process had two more children. And in doing that, I was always very clear that my career was important to me and I wanted to shift back to it. But once I was in that role, like it took a while to kind of get head above water, and to see that my self-care was not where it should be, right? Because like you said, you feed, you clean, and you nurture. And that was the cycle. And that was the cycle I was in. And that's how I was showing love and care. And on top of that, because of my training, I was doing a lot to sort of raise my children in very conscious ways. And I was putting a lot of my energy towards that in my marriage. And then in the process, I was fading into the background, right? That my own needs, my own self-care needs was fading into the background. And so there were moments where I sort of popped my head up and started the self-care routine. And then very quickly it would get subsumed back under family requirements. And so it took me coming to this point of starting this company, of really thinking about, okay, so if I am serious about my healing and I understand that healing is a journey, where do I interrupt this pattern? And what is this pattern reminiscent of, right? How does generational trauma happen? How do we continue to pass those things on? As I'm consciously thinking about them, here are the things I'm unconsciously doing that's sending a very different message and I want to send to my children. And being a stay-at-home mom was absolutely what I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted my children and myself to have a different version of the story, right?
Mm-hmm.
That it wanted it to look very different than what it meant for my mamas to take care of me.
That's really good. I want to, you brought up generational trauma, so I want to specifically talk about that because I think people hear that term a lot and may not really understand what it means. But
Mhm.
before I ask you that part, what was
Mhm.
it like to go against what you know to be true? I think that a lot of times when people have not seen our caregivers take care of themselves, we feel guilty. We feel like we're doing something we're not supposed to do.
Yes.
Because I want to be clear about that transition. It
Mhm.
wasn't just like, oh, let me start taking care of myself when I start tomorrow.
It was
What was that
intentional.
like?
Yeah, it was intentional. It was intentional. And it was like a 3-month process. I have this wonderful accountability partner, and we were talking like 3 days a week. I would get up, I still get up at 5:30 in the morning because that's one of my self-care things. Once the house is up, there's too much noise. So I wake up before everybody gets up, I meditate, I do my exercise, I take care of myself, and then I'm available to everyone else. But we were having these early morning meetings, and the questions we were asking was, how do we do this? Like, how do I actually carve out time for me that is just mine? And to give you an example around how it's a constant, back and forth, I just finished teaching a course, right? The course ended last Saturday. I am drained, right? I'm tired. And I'm taking this weekend to sort of go away, be by myself and rejuvenate. And there's a part of me that still feels guilty, right? That still feels like, oh, I'm leaving the family. They're gonna be fine. They're gonna be okay. And I know that. But yet and still, there's still this tension of this is what I'm supposed to be doing versus this is what I know works, right? That when I'm giving from a cup that's overflowing, there's more to give.
Yes.
There's much more to give than when I'm, dripping out the little bits that are left. And if I don't fill my cup, then I don't have that overflow to give to other people. Right.
Right.
And it's important to step out of it. And you say, how did it happen? It happened by a lack of consciousness, right?
Yep.
Like if I just go with the flow of things, that's the pattern we fall into because someone will always need your energy.
Mm-hmm.
Always, guaranteed. And if you have children, you know what I'm talking about. They will always need you. And so there is a point where you have to consciously say, I need me. And I'm tapped right now, and I don't have enough to give you unless I take this time to refill my cup.
Yes. And two things I just want to highlight what Dr. Barbara said was the accountability partner. Sometimes it does take that accountability partner to help hold you accountable.
Mhm.
I also want to highlight the fact that, she's talking about even now, she still feels the guilt,
Mhm.
but she's not going with the feeling. She's moving despite the feeling.
Mhm.
Those feelings are going to come and go.
Yes.
I think we don't feel like going to work sometimes when we go, but we know how to survive.
Mhm.
And so, the same way what you're doing this weekend to help you live,
Mhm.
you're acknowledging, like, I feel guilty, but I also understand logically it's the best thing to do for me.
Yes.
So,
And
that's so good.
that's that idea of radical presence that I offer to people, right? That you bring a certain consciousness about what you do and how you do it, and from that place of consciousness, make the choices you need to make. Right?
Mm-hmm,
So
mm-hmm.
you bring that radical presence, and that creates the responsibility. And by responsibility, it's that ability to respond to yourself wholeheartedly. right?
Mhm.
And you can't do that without the awareness. You can't do that without the consciousness. If I just feel that feeling of guilt and let that guilt drive my choices, then I'm back on the hamster wheel, right? But if I
Mhm.
feel that feeling of guilt, if I see it, feel it in my body and say, okay, I feel guilty. These are the reasons I feel guilty. The kids are gonna, they're not gonna do as much, they're not gonna eat as well, whatever the reasons I list for myself. And
Mhm.
I'm like, okay, I see you. And I need this for myself, right? Have that conversation with myself, see what's happening in my body when I feel that, versus making a decision from that place of like, oh, I'm abandoning my kids, I'm leaving my family,
Right.
right? That radical presence with yourself.
You have such a soothing voice.
Thank you.
uh, so generational. We're gonna talk about radical presence because that's literally your mantra. That's your brand. But generational trauma.
Yeah.
Let's go into generational trauma and what that looks like. Because I don't think people understand how powerful that can be.
Oh my God.
There's this thing called habit energy,
Mhm,
right? Where we are doing things and don't recognize it, but it's out of habits. It's our
mhm,
environment, the energy that's been passed on, the
mhm,
generational trauma. Can you talk to people a little bit about what that looks like in real life so that they can understand how
mhm,
they may be affected?
mhm. I think of it as I think the most visceral way that I tend to explain generational trauma is for example, for Black people, right? It doesn't matter if you're in this country or another country, but let's go with US, uh, um, you know, on this side of the hemisphere, Black people who have lived through and survived slavery, right? So let's just take it that far back to make the most visceral example possible, and then I'll bring it back to some more realistic ones. Let's say you survived that, right? And you birthed children, and clearly you did because we're all still here. The things that you did to survive become the things you teach your children. So imagine your life doesn't belong to you, your body doesn't belong to you, your life does not belong to you, right? So if we think about trauma as being energy that's trapped in the body, what I teach my children is that your life doesn't belong to you, your body doesn't belong to you. And here are the ways to stay safe in that threat, right? And so when the next generation comes, they may have a very different version of that story, but it's now in their very cells, in their very DNA, in the very way they see and understand and think of themselves, right? And then on top of that, you have the outside structures that are reinforcing those beliefs, right? So fast forward to today, you've got people living in a world where state violence, police violence, mass incarceration, all of these things say to you, your life does not belong to you, your very body doesn't belong to you. And so we continue to act out these trauma responses in our everyday life. That's the more visceral example, right? If we bring it home sort of to a more everyday example, the way we raise our children, right, is a direct reflection of the way that we were raised, unless we can make conscious decisions to interrupt those patterns. So think about the things that you find yourself saying to a little person, whether or not they're yours, right? For example, I have friends who find it difficult to be around my children because they're allowed to express their anger, right? They're allowed to scream, to if they need to stomp their feet, slam the door, whatever. They're allowed to express their anger. And there's an impulse in you that says, hey, no, especially especially around Haitians, uh-uh. You don't get to talk that way. You don't get to own that body language. You don't own your body. Your life doesn't belong to you, and your body doesn't belong to you, right? So that we reinforce it in the way that we train each other around how to be in the world. So there's a way that we have to understand that if trauma removes your dignity, right? If that's one of the things that when you experience a traumatic event, there is something that acts on your very dignity, your right as a person to own your body. Then that I lost my train of thought. That gets to be how you experience yourself, and the little ways that that's translated down to you through discipline, through choices that you're allowed to or not allowed to make. I don't know if I'm being clear around how I'm explaining it, but generational trauma is this thing that's passed down, and it's passed down in the larger ways that we get to relate to society, and it's passed down in very micro ways in terms of how we relate to authority or parents or within our families.
No, you explained it very, very, very well. And I think
Mhm.
that a lot of times we do things, or we'll grow up and say, "I'm never going to do that to my kid," or "I'm
Mhm.
never going to be that way," and we'll find ourselves doing the same thing.
Mhm.
I'll have clients talk about, when their parent did X, Y, and Z, and then they'll talk about some behavior, and I'm like, it sounds like somebody you does that sound like somebody you know?
Yeah.
And they're like, oh my God, that's like what my mom did, or that's what my
Yes.
dad did. And
Yes.
so I don't think we're consciously aware
Yeah.
of what we're doing. We don't connect it to our history.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when we start to become more presently
Yeah.
aware, we
Yeah.
can have more understanding
Yes.
and make different choices
Yes.
that allow us to live and not just survive.
Yeah, that allow us to live very differently, right? That allow us to live consciously, but more importantly, that breaks the cycle of generational trauma, right?
Yeah.
That's the goal, right? And unless we're aware of it happening, then we can't break the cycle,
Yeah.
right? And there's something swimming around in my head is this idea of shame and how shame plays into this, right? And I'm thinking about the example of children, right? The way that um, I can't, it's not a clear thought yet, but that there is a way that generational trauma is passed down through shame, right? That desire to not disappoint, that hiding, right? That shame, the impulse of shame, the bodily impulse of shame is to close out, to hide, to isolate, to not let yourself be seen. And there's a way that when that removal of dignity happens, that's what happens to a person, right? They go inward. And that shame, the bigger the shame is, the more we want to hide ourselves from the world. So there's a way that shame, I think, is the tool, it's the generational tool that's being used to kind of keep people in this cycle, right? And there is a way that you have to kind of turn inward toward it and then step out of it. And that takes very particular types of work.
I
Right?
want to just get a little bit more clearer on the shame part. People bring
Hmm.
that up. A lot of my guests bring that up as being a issue.
Hmm.
Uh, when you say shame, are you referring to not living up to a certain standard, or tell me what you
No,
mean when you
I,
think about shame?
when I'm talking about shame, I'm talking about the emotion, right? The
Okay.
emotion of shame, the bodily response that makes you want to hide,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
That thing that says to you, "I'm bad." Not
Mhm.
I did something bad, but I am bad.
Oh
Not
yeah.
I said something wrong, but I am wrong.
Mhm.
It's that self-incrimination. I am, there's something inherently wrong with me.
Ah, yes.
That's shame.
And that happens, because of, like, I grew up, I didn't, if I was crying, it's like, if you're not bleeding, you shouldn't be crying.
Right.
And I'm really big on emotions, and like I have an
Hmm.
emotion chart.
Yeah.
My kids can express their emotions, because it's
Yeah.
crazy how, we tell, kids not to, what are you sad for? They'll say,
Hmm.
like, what are you sad for? You don't have bills. I'm like, they're 6, they wouldn't have bills, right? Like,
Right. Right.
so if
A really big emotion.
yeah. If they're sad about a cookie, it's okay. They're 6. Like, that's what 6-year-olds are sad about.
Yes.
And being able to embrace that, I think, is important.
Hmm.
But I think that for, the way that I operate with them is me breaking the cycle. And
Hmm.
I feel like what happens, because I only see adults, and when I hear their stories,
Hmm.
they've internalized their environment, right? And I think that's the shame. Like, and they
Hmm.
embody
Hmm.
everything happening around them that has nothing to do with them, but nobody's saying anything,
Yes.
right? Nobody's having that dialogue with them. And so as
Hmm.
they become older, they own this narrative that's not who they are.
Exactly. That's
That's
exactly it.
probably what you're saying.
Yes, think about when you if you work with survivors,
Hmm.
oftentimes the main issue is it's my fault.
Hmm.
I'm responsible. I'm to blame. Somehow, even though I was only 3 or 4 or 5 years old,
Hmm.
I did something to invite this, right? I am wrong.
Yeah.
Not this thing happened to me that was terrible, but I am wrong.
Yeah.
And that feeling of I am wrongness gets to dampen every other emotion that surrounds you, right? Like people
Yeah.
don't have access to a range of emotions because shame
Right.
binds. Shame grabs onto your joy and says, "What the hell do you have to be happy about?"
Right.
Shame grabs onto your anger and says, "You've got no right to be angry." Right?
Right.
Shame continues to dull and dull and dull our sense.
Think about everything you're talking about, right? I like talking about the issue, but I think about, like, well, what's the solution, right?
Right.
Because I'm really big on, like, decolonizing what mental health looks like. It's not just psychiatry and therapy.
Mhm.
A lot of, like, what you do is not things that are taught, and I think that these are things that we can do in the comfort of our own home,
Yes.
become self-aware. But then, like, the government's not going to get paid if I become self-aware and I don't need no meds.
Right.
So I always say, like, our system treats the symptoms. They do not get to the root of the problem. And I'm hoping, like with this podcast, is to help people get more to the root and have more clarity. So tell me about radical presence. Like, where did the name come from? And look at you smiling as the audience listening on the audio. She's like smiling. This is her stuff right here.
Yes, yes.
Tell us about radical presence, because
So
it's so dope.
you said where the name comes from, and honestly, I don't. It was just this idea of presence and how important presence was, and I was like, well, what? How can you be? Like, how can we teach presence? How do we teach people to be radically present? Like, it was like one of those moments. Like it was inspired by the thing I wanted to teach people to do, right? And I'll tell you a story. I was listening to, I think it was like Carolyn Mace or something, and she was talking about that 40 days, right? That you think about like Jesus in the desert, or any sort of like a spiritual quest, right? There is this thing attached to 40 days. And she said, if you want an answer, if you want a real answer that is divinely answered, write it on a piece of paper, put it on your altar, and within 40 days, you'll have an answer. And I was like, I can try that. And so this was at the moment that the Black Lives Matter moment was happening, right, in the country. The Black Lives Matter was going on. And I had friends who were sort of going to protest. They were getting really charged and really activated, and then coming back into their lives, still charged and still activated, and had no way to put down the emotional stuff they were picking up at these protests, and then trying to go back into regular life. Not to mention the Orange Man was here, and everything that was happening around immigration, and just like the world was coming apart at the seams. My world, anyway, and those around me, their lives were coming apart at the seams because there was so much emotional tension that people didn't know what to do with. So on a piece of paper, I wrote, how do I use what I know to help people heal from racial trauma? Put it down, put it on the altar. And then, I kid you not, working with my accountability partner, I forgot about that piece of paper because 40 days is a long time in this day and age. And we went about our business, and I created Radical Presence. I got the URL. I did everything I needed to do legally to create this. Have no idea what it was going to be. I just knew this was going to be the name. And then when I remembered about 3 weeks later, I looked at that piece of paper. I created that on the 40th day. Right. So that was like,
wow, that's crazy.
that was the divinely answered. That was the divinely answered prayer right there. Right. So radical presence is it. And then, so radical presence for me is about teaching people consciousness raising skills. How do I help people become more present in their bodies, more embodied, more aware, not just spiritually, but physically more aware, and emotionally more aware? Because it's within those three awarenesses, physically, emotionally, and spiritually, that we become fully grounded, right? We become fully present in the moment. And it's from that present moment that we can actually do our work of healing, right? You can't heal in the past, and you can't heal the past. You can't heal in the future because you haven't gotten there yet. You've got one chance, and it's in the present. So my question really was about, how do I do this radical presence work? And I started working with people and teaching courses around the gifts of emotions, about how to use empathetic skills, how to use empathy to really connect with yourself and others. Because at the end of the day, what we were all struggling with was isolation, right? We're trying to sort of deal with this on our own, and that's not the answer. And so the other question that I later had was, I'm a survivor of sexual assault, and I'm a childhood sexual abuse survivor. And I asked the same question again: how do I use this past? How do I use this past of survivorship to help people heal? And the answer was radical presence, the radical presence course that I teach, which is called Coming Home. And that so far has been the thing that I continue to teach over and over again. And that is because it's for women of color. It's a closed space for women of color. And inevitably, the race piece comes back in, right? We deal with both. We deal with both what it means to be a survivor of childhood sexual abuse or child abuse, period, and what it means to live your life as a BIPOC woman, as a BIPOC person, trying to thrive in this environment that is not always receptive, right? That more often than not is hostile to your very survival. So, yeah, radical presence was kind of born out of not just divine inspiration, but like a desire to really have a real change on seeing Black people be embodied, to see us be in our skin, right? And what it means, what kind of creativity, what kind of power is possible when we're in our bodies and in ourselves.
The power is real. Well, speaking of sexual abuse and trauma, one of the things that happens for people that are listening that go through trauma is that sometimes, in order to survive, you leave your body, like you are not there. So your body's holding on to the trauma.
Hmm.
For people that are listening, because you brought up a really good point about, I'm assuming coming home is coming back to yourself, right?
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
coming
that's
right
dope.
back
I
to the
love
body.
that.
Yeah.
And so for people that may, and one of the things that I love doing is helping people become self-aware, um, understanding what's happening in their body. But can you tell people about like how that happens, with the trauma you
Mhm.
experience and the need for you to escape to kind of survive it? And this could be, it doesn't have to be sexual, it could be physical, even emotional, psychological trauma. There's a lot of things that people go through, and they may not understand that just because they weren't like physically or
Mhm.
sexually hurt,
Mhm.
the emotional and psychological pain can hurt just as
Oh,
deep.
yeah. 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 So I can explain it one of two ways. And if I forget one, just remind me I said two, two ways. But the first one is so trigger warning for your audience, right? So I'm a survivor of sexual abuse. I'm going to talk about that experience as a way to explain the kind of coming home and what you were talking about with disassociation. So my first experience of sexual abuse happened when I was really young. I would say about four, right? 4 or 5. And in that experience, I literally left my body because there is no way that I could have physically survived what happened to me. In that moment, right? My brain, that limbic brain made a decision that the best way to survive was to run, to not be there, to not be in that experience, right? So I have this relationship to the memory where I can go to the door, but I can't go past it. I don't know what happened in that. I don't know what happened in that space because my spirit moved up in order to protect my body, right? And I do a lot of explaining about the way that our consciousness can move in and out of our bodies and why we have to call it back and bring it back to ourselves. And so in that moment of disassociation, that was a protective measure. That was my consciousness choosing to protect my physical body by leaving, right? It's often been called an immobility response, a death response. It's called lots of different things. But what's important is that in the disconnection, in the disassociation became my trauma response, right? So it became then how I related to anything that activated me emotionally, right? So it became the thing that I did again and again. And therein lies the problem. While it made a lot of sense while my 5-year-old body was being violated, it doesn't make sense when my supervisor is critiquing my work, right? It doesn't make sense when my friends are mad at me about something. And so that the trauma response, the thing that helped you survive becomes how you respond in the world. And that response is too big for the experiences that you're having. And so until I came into relationship with that disassociated self, which means with the shame, with the guilt, with all the emotions I had about her, about my experiences as that child's experience, I wasn't able to look at it and reincorporate it, right? And reincorporate the memory and hence my spirit back to my body. So that's kind of one way I can explain it in terms of my own personal experience. The other way that we can think about it is people think that you have to experience something as big as rape as a child to experience trauma. It's not so, right? Trauma is just an incomplete reaction. Something happened, your fight, flight, fawn responses are activated, and you don't get a chance to complete that reaction, right? So say someone threw a ball at you and you saw it coming. It was one of those huge 20-pound balls. You saw it coming to your head and you wanted to react, you wanted to run, you started to, and then bam, the ball got you in the head and you passed out. And so now your body didn't get to complete that desire to protect itself. That can create trauma, right? It doesn't have to be something as disturbing as being violated as a child. And so the idea is then that what we want to do is to come back to our bodies in order to allow ourselves to complete the response, right? To give ourselves an opportunity to complete that emotional response and hence create some sort of stasis, some sort of like um, evenness around how we relate it. And I always say to people, healing does not mean that thing no longer happened. It doesn't mean that I think back on being 5 and all of a sudden I never had this, terrible experience with this person. what it means is that I can look at it and I don't need to run from myself. I can look at it and I don't feel that sense of I must have been a terrible child or a terribly seductive child, if nothing else, to for this to happen to me, right? Like the stories get to quiet down and I can look at it and say, wow, that was a terrible thing that happened to me. And just let it be that, right? So
That's the end of misunderstanding.
Mhm.
And you can transform your suffering when you start to lean into it as opposed to running away from it. And I always say to people, like, when you really think about it, how could we possibly run away from our minds? I
Yes,
think we try,
but we
in
try.
our culture, in society, in that this American culture with
Mhm.
between the Netflix and the social media and
Mhm.
everything else, the easily to buy on Amazon, when
Yeah.
we're struggling, we have to lean into it if we want to
Yeah.
heal, or we're just going to keep running and running and running, and we're not going anywhere.
Mhm. Mhm.
You can't escape your experiences.
No, the only way through it is through it,
Yeah,
right? If you want to get to the other side, you have to walk through it.
yeah,
And by walking through it, I think a lot of what I hear is that it's fear, right? Because think about what it must have felt like in my 5-year-old body to have that experience. Terrifying. And that terror now lives inside me, right? That terror is in my body. So when I experience anxiety, that terror is real, right? Like if I'm having a moment where something is threatening, for example, the terror that shows up in my body is real. So for me to actually approach that terror takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of trust that I can get to the other side. And it takes a lot of knowing, right? You have to learn some things first about your resilience, your ability to get through it and get to the other side. So it's not, I don't want to make it sound like, oh, just, pay attention to your emotions. It's not that simple, right? It does take work. That's why we call healing, it's a healing journey. And some days I'm a lot closer to the finish line than others. And you know what I mean? It's always it's a back and forth. But the only way to get through is to move through the emotion, to allow it to move through you, experience what it feels like for anxiety to take over my body. And I can do that if I watch what's happening in my body when anxiety shows up. All of a
yeah,
sudden, it's like, oh, okay, it's not so big. But now maybe my hands are shaking, right?
yeah,
And that's happening. Okay, I can see that. I can be with it. Okay, so maybe there's heat in my back, like, and I can be with those sensations as they move through me. And at the end of the day, I'm still standing, right?
yes,
I'm still here. But that grip, that anxiety, that terror had on me just loosened a little
yeah,
bit. I
yeah.
gave it some attention, right?
Yeah. And so, give for people listening, give yourself some grace.
Grace.
Sometimes what's happening in front of you, you may feel guilty or bad because it doesn't match the extreme emotion happening inside. But
Mm-hmm.
that's a real thing that's happening. So I need you to like work on leaning into it. And I
Yeah.
think the biggest thing, and like we're saying, is that, you can't, obviously, we can't escape what happened,
Mm-hmm.
but we can change the narrative.
Yeah.
And also, I think that it doesn't no longer have a grip on us where
Yeah.
we're making these impulsive decisions or feeling
Mm-hmm.
paralyzed.
Mm-hmm.
The pain may still show up, but it won't be as debilitating as
Yes.
it used to be. And I think that's so such an important thing to remember as you're, go doing this work is hard. If it was easy, everybody would do it.
Everybody would do it.
Yeah, but just remember your why. Like, I always tell people, when you're working on, healing the inner child and
Mhm.
working on you, you remember your why, like what's your goal. So when it gets hard, you keep that goal in front of you,
Yeah. Yeah.
so that you can know what you're aiming for. Because
Mhm.
it's easy to just go back to what you know,
Yeah, right. It's that
unfortunately.
habit memory you were talking
The
about earlier,
habit,
right?
yeah,
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 it's the way that it's our default.
yeah,
And default is what we fall into more comfortably. And the conscious way requires thought and effort, right?
hmm
It's a difference between being able to like sit upright and just
hmm
kind of slouch into your comfortable position. This is
yeah,
better for your posture. It's better for your body, your health, your longevity, your ability to breathe. It has lots of wonderful effects. But you have to remember to do this, right? And then you'll be able to do it longer and longer before you do this again. But you've got to remind yourself, right? Shoulders back.
intentional. It's intentional.
Intentionality.
You're such a good teacher.
Yeah.
Speaking of you being a teacher, you
Mhm.
talked about a course you created, because I know after all of your amazing teaching you just did on this podcast, people are probably wanting to know like what it is that it looks like. Can you tell people a little
Yeah.
bit about radical presence?
So Radical Presence is a group of courses that I teach. So I teach in two ways. I offer one-on-one coaching, but I also do small group coaching. And the small group coaching is the Radical Presence courses. They tend to be small, they're intimate groups, and I tend to keep them single focused. So, for example, the last one was all survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And the courses are virtual, they're offered online, and it's an 8-week course. And we go through the entire 8 weeks together as a unit, and we talk through very intentionally about what it means to be radically present as a person who's surviving sexual trauma. And I give you specific tools and specific practices. This is a meditative practice. It is a lot of learning about trauma, how trauma operates in the body, how trauma operates in the brain, and then doing some very specific types of things like inner child work, right? Like presencing, the things that are happening in your body. We do a lot of the embodiment somatic work where we follow the emotions that are coming up in the body, so that we can move through. Like I was saying, we go through from beginning to end. You'll be able to kind of experience it and go through.
Thank you for that. I just want to read a testimonial from one of your clients. Working with Dr. Schreiber has honestly saved my life. I've learned why I become apathetic and numb when life gets overwhelming. She's taught me that even negative emotions have a gift to offer. I've learned to be more mindful and present in my body. She's a wonderful person to have in my corner. Thank you so much, Barbara. That's amazing. And just because that negative thing stuck out for me,
Mhm.
tell people why, because we're human, we're gonna have emotions, but the negative ones, we want to ignore them as if they're just gonna go away magically.
Yes, and I think the word negative emotion is put in quotes, and
She
it's sort
put
of
it in
tongue in
quotes. The
cheek.
person, yeah, they put it in
Mhm.
quotes.
And it's sort of tongue in cheek because one of my favorite things is there's no such thing as a negative emotion. all emotions are here to teach, right? And the question is, what gift does that emotion have to offer, right? So just shifting away from this idea that there's such a thing as a negative emotion. Anger, for example, I love this idea that anger is your warrior. Remember the warriors in Wakanda? That's always the image that I use when I teach about anger. She had a job, right? And her job was to protect the king. And so your anger protects the kingdom. It protects you, right? So there's anger is not a negative emotion. Anger, all of them give you information, right? So this idea that no matter how sad your sad gets, that sadness is there to teach you something. And again, if you can approach it with curiosity and knowing that your body wisdom is the best wisdom there is, right? That what your body is trying to tell you is there for your healing. And if you can move toward it, you can learn from its wisdom and apply it, right? So,
That's good. It is trying, and I've my 8-year-old deals with some anxiety, and so
mhm.
and I it's hard for me to see her like that, but I feel so grateful that she has language. She'll be like, my stomach's doing the twisty thing again, I'm gonna do some jumping jacks, right?
Yes,
Or I'm gonna write, and then she was like, wow, that felt so good,
yes,
and I'm like, imagine if this was like taught in schools around the world,
yes.
like how much more at peace we would be with experiencing some of the things we experience and not feel. If she didn't have language to, like,
Mhm,
if she's throwing up or her stomach's knotting up,
mhm.
she becomes an adult, and then that continues to carry on, and she
Needs to
doesn't
cover.
understand she's leaving her home, right?
Yes,
She doesn't want to be in her body
in
because
her
it feels
body.
so hard.
Yes, yeah.
So
And
go ahead.
yeah, and let me just say, this post-COVID madness, like when kids go back to school, this stuff needs to be in the classrooms.
Yes.
It absolutely needs to be in the classroom. My kid went to school one day in March, came home, and nothing was ever the same again, right? Like their books, I mean, literally, it was like Chernobyl. Everything got left exactly where it was, and the kids never went back. And they did a drive-through at some point where teachers handed them their stuff in bags,
Right.
but that was it. And just think about like that abandonment, right? The trauma of separation
Mhm.
that kids could have experienced in that moment. And then they're in this weird, like loopy world where they're in front of a computer and nothing makes sense and they can't see their friends. And my kids have had a couple of COVID scares where we've had to quarantine. Like all of those things like sink into their bodies, and their sense of insecurity is going to like just be massive, right? So
Yeah.
I hope somewhere someone has the wherewithal to say that we do need to have this in the classroom, right?
Yeah.
It needs to be a part of how we manage reentry from COVID is
Yeah.
the mental health aspect that children are going to be suffering.
And for my parents listening, you know, I know like for us as adults, it's been hard with managing a lot, but I do want you to understand because it may seem like, well, the kids, they just get to like be on the computer or do X, Y, and Z. Their brains are still going, trying to make sense. So really having conversation is really important. It goes a long way. Take it from somebody that like experienced not having conversation and
Mhm.
holding on to stuff and just leaning into myself and becoming so depressed to somebody who's a therapist working with adults and hearing these stories around the narrative that they created based off of the lack of dialogue.
Yeah.
And so the whole world, you know, we experienced this pandemic, this um, racism, like everything that's happening that we can't escape as a collective. That everyone is feeling it in some form, shape, or fashion. So really be mindful of that, you know, with your kids. So you're amazing. Do you want to do a grounding tech? Do you feel like doing a grounding technique?
Sure. Absolutely.
Okay.
So grounding is the way that I start and end every single session that I do. And it's something that's super important. We can do a very quick one. But
Can you tell people what grounding is too?
yes, so grounding is a very quick way to get centered, to come into the present, be in the present, and be rooted in the present. Right? It's a very quick way. If you're disassociating, if you're feeling unfocused and out of it, if you are dealing with intense emotion, right? You can take a few minutes, ground yourself, and then come back to what you were doing, right? Come back, you because it's that coming back home, coming back to yourself. So grounding is a wonderful way to come back to yourself.
Dr. Schreiber, I just love that coming back home. That is so like every time you say it, I'm like, that is such an amazing name. I get my heart warms. I feel warm.
Oh, that's
I'm gonna
awesome.
start telling people to go back home. You gotta get back home. Okay, go
Yes,
ahead.
get back to this place, right? It's the only one you'll have, right? So this is home. So let's do it. Let's do ground. Let's ground very quickly. So I invite you to close your eyes. If closing your eyes is not comfortable for you, then just very gently lower your gaze so that you're kind of looking kind of midway, so that not too many distractions are happening for you. So taking a very deep breath in. And so the first thing I'd invite you to notice is the cool air moving in through your nose and the warm air coming out when you exhale. So for one more breath, just notice that. Cool air in, warm air out. And then just bringing your attention to your body. If you're leaning back on something, how your back feels against that surface. If you're sitting, what the back of your legs feel like connected to the chair or the bed. And then moving down to your feet. Notice what your feet feel like on the ground. And notice the earth underneath rise up to meet you. And breathing here for a moment. In through your nose and out through your feet. And on your next exhale, imagine roots growing out of your feet. And with every exhale, those roots get deeper and wider. And you're 5 feet deep, and they're growing still. Now they're 10 feet deep. Feel the connection to the very energy of this earth that sustains us. With every out breath growing deeper still, you're grounded. And on the next exhale, very slowly opening your eyes. Maybe rolling your hands around in a circle if that feels comfortable. Or moving your head from side to side. And then once your eyes are open, just look around you very slowly. Over your left shoulder, and then come back to center. And then over your other shoulder, coming back to center.
That was good. The breath work is so good for people listening. One thing for like if this is something that you did close to you, obviously, this is a podcast, so you can always come back to it if it was grounding. But I talk to people about, taking at least 2 minutes to start and just breathing deeply because we're walking around so tense.
Yeah.
You know, before the pandemic, we were already struggling, and I think now, the vaccines are here, and people are still on edge, but I think that now, like, we've been in survival mode now, like the mental health is about to be a major crisis. And for people that's been holding their breath, I do want you to, think about making space, intentional space, to really breathe. You'll be surprised. I learned, that I was not, you're welcome. I learned that I was not breathing properly when I started doing yoga. And I know you're a yoga teacher as well. But just the breath work and yoga, I remember now, like if I'm driving, I can feel when I'm clenching and I'm like, oh my gosh. Or if I'm washing my hands, I'll like do like this just to be present. There's really small things that we can do in our day to day that can help us like really get present.
Yeah.
And there's so much power in being present. And I know for some, it's always been a scary thing, because we've always learned, well, we just figured out like how to survive and run. And so we don't have to stay in survival mode. We can actually start to live, and just the breath work and just like this grounding technique is like part of your medicine. It could be part of your healing process. It's going to take a lot, but I think with intentionality and consistency, you'll start to feel the changes.
Yeah. And then you can make little changes right throughout your day, very small ones, and that bringing your attention to your breath and to your nose and the temperature. It's a very small one, but it's enough to bring you out of a disassociated moment back to the present, right? It's enough to bring you back to your body. So it's do the little things, right? I always felt like I had to do a huge workout. I can do the little things, right?
Yep.
And those little things add up over time.
Yes, thank you. This was so good. You're so calming. Your voice is you're such a good teacher. You're so calming. I appreciate your presence, your radical presence.
Thank you for having me. I had such a wonderful time talking to you. And you were
Good.
my teaching, and I noticed the way that you have been teaching throughout this too. So I appreciate the way that you teach, and it's a subtle kind of insert here and there, and you've been doing it throughout. So I thank you for also teaching the way that you do and having this as a forum for people to learn these things, right? We talk about making mental health accessible. This is one of the ways that you're doing that. So thank you.
You're welcome. So for people that want to know how to connect with her, there is the website, which is Center for Souls Healing .com. So centersforsoulhealing.com. Looks like you are on Instagram. You're also on Facebook.
Yes,
Go ahead.
I found it Instagram at radical presence _ or the website, like you said, the Center for Souls Healing.com. And also you can find me by on Facebook with just my name, Barbara Ceptus Schreiber.
And then can I just say, like, for people listening, on her website, there's this picture of a tree and nature. There's something so grounding about being in nature. I've become a lover of the woods and hiking. I never thought it was only for white people. And I started going. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so good.
Think about where our people are from, right? Like being in the land and with the land and with nature. It's one of the technologies that we have that helps us in our healing journey. And we've been disconnected from so many of those things, and they're coming back.
They're coming back. It's free. It's free to go in the woods. It might be a little scary at
You don't
first,
need
but
gear, you don't need the North Face. You just need you and your shoes. And sometimes you don't even need them.
as soon as I go in there, I just start like, oh, like I just start. Or if I see water, like when I'm around water, and I'm just like, I used to pass by the woods, to pass by the water, and never felt that before. But I never actually was present before. Yeah. And now that I'm present, I can smell the roses. I can see it and I can feel it, and it feels so good. So thank you so much. I can talk to you all night, Dr. Barbara.
Let's continue to have this conversation. This was wonderful. I am energized. I feel wonderful. Thank you, Celeste. Thank you.
Good. I hope you have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you. She was awesome. So thank you guys for tuning in. So this is actually the video will be on YouTube and Facebook. The podcast will be available next Sunday. It'll be released next Sunday. So you can definitely find it there. You guys give Dr. Barbara Schreiber a follow. She's a really amazing follow. Especially like thinking about the courses that she teaches. If trying to get back into your home, into yourself, is something that is important to you. You can't do it alone. I think, a lot of times we've tried to do it alone. We've been told to be strong. And I just want to caution you that being strong is actually being able to acknowledge all of you, not just part of you, the hard parts, right? The trauma parts. It's a part of who you are, and being able to acknowledge that can be such a grounding experience. So thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back Monday to talk to somebody else that's doing something to empower the lives of
165 days, but I treat every day like it's my last. I'm only concerned with building on the future, cause I can't change my past. Positive vibes for positive lives. She just giving you that truth and shifting your mind. It's more mental than you realize. It's up to you to take control, cause this world is cold and negativity gon' take its toll. Now we've been told any day could be your last. I'm embracing every moment and I cherish every laugh, every smile, every hug, every kiss, every touch, every person in my life that I care about and love. But wait, maybe I'm getting too emotional. That's exactly what they say you ain't supposed to do. Suppress your feelings, never talk about your pain. Can't appreciate the sun without acknowledging it rains, right? That's right. So this a moment of clarity, and make sure you always protect your energy. You stay focused and your life gon' be lit. And you are now rocking with Celeste, the therapist.